All right, so we are going to talk about different types of tissues. Remember what a tissue is when we talked about our levels of organization. Tissue is similar cells working together as a group to perform a specific function. So remember back to our levels, we've talked about the atomic level, where we've talked about the nucleus with the electrons flying around it and all about that. We've talked about different molecules, specifically our biological molecules that are important to the human body. We talked about those 4 different groups, and then we've talked about how we take those biological molecules and we put them together to make organelles, and we've talked about different types of organelles. We've talked about cells as a whole as it relates to those different organelles in the plasma membrane and how it interacts with cell communication. And now we're going to talk just a little bit about tissues, because remember then we're taking our cells, our individual cells, putting them together as a group to perform a specific function. So there are 4 different types of tissues, or tissue groups, that you need to know. The first one is our epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue. And our epithelial tissue is generally considered a lining type of tissue. So it lines different areas. So, for example, it lines the outside of the body, as in our skin is a type of epithelial tissue. It lines the inside of our blood vessels, makes them nice and smooth. The inner lining is an epithelial tissue. Also, it lines the inside of our lungs, also our digestive tract or intestines, so stomach and mouth region. So really it lines a lot of the body. It's a lot of what our different serous membranes are made up as well. Remember the visceral pleura, for example, and the parietal pleura. All of those are made up of epithelial cells and epithelial tissues. The second type of tissue that you need to know is connective tissue. And as its name implies, it is a tissue that's used to connect things, but it also has many other functions. And that's because as we're talking about these different tissues, there are actually tissues, specific tissue types within these tissue groups. We're just looking at the groups. For example, the epithelial tissue that we just talked about, there are different types. There's simple squamous, there's simple cuboidal, there's pseudostratified. So there are different types of epithelial tissues, and we'll talk about them more as we move throughout the systems. And that's the same thing that we see with connective tissue. So connective tissue is kind of where we put everything that doesn't fit into some of these other categories. So there are definitely some that connect, like our areolar tissue is good for connecting, but it's also good for protection. And our areolar connective tissue, for example, we find some white blood cells. And if we find white blood cells in there, then it's good for protecting because it's going to be helpful for our immune system. But at the same time, we have the connectivity factor because it has lots of fibers and things that are going to hold one tissue to another tissue. Another example of connective tissue would be our blood is a connective tissue. It's connecting tissues all around the body. It's bringing things to different cells. It's taking things away from the cells. Our blood, also bone, is a type of connective tissue. So that's used for strength and for movement. So you can see that not only are there connective type tissues, but there are others that have other functions as well. So then as we move on from our connective tissue, the next type of tissue that you need to know is muscular tissue. And we have 3 different types of muscular tissue, but all 3 different types are really for movement. Because they contract. And if we can have a contraction, that's because we have this electrical signal that's going to be sent, and they can contract and cause movement. So the 3 different types of muscular tissue that we have are cardiac tissue, cardiac muscle tissue, and of course that's in the heart. And it is a muscle, and that it has movement. It provides movement. It contracts the heart. We have our skeletal muscle. So this one is going to move bones and allow us to move around in our external environment. And then we have smooth muscle. And the smooth muscle we're really going to see in the walls of hollow organs. Walls of... All right, let me back that up there. Walls of hollow organs. There we go. So some examples there would be like in the blood vessels, we see smooth muscle that's helping our blood vessels to move the blood along. Also in our stomach and our intestines, moving things around. But we are not in control of smooth muscle. So smooth muscle is involuntary. So these are muscles that we have in our body that move on their own. Skeletal muscle is voluntary for the most part. There's the diaphragm that is also made up partially of skeletal muscle that we don't have full control over. We do have partial control over, like if we were to hold our breath or to take a deeper breath. But our skeletal muscles are voluntary, our smooth muscle is involuntary, and then of course our cardiac muscle is also involuntary. We don't will our heart to pump. All right, so those are our muscular tissues, or the third group of tissues is the muscular tissue. And then within that third group, we have these three, the cardiac, skeletal, and smooth. And then the last group, our fourth group of tissues, is our nervous tissue. And our nervous tissue, the function there is communication. And communication that is high speed specifically. So our high speed electrical and chemical communication. And so remember that we've talked about different types of cell communication. One of those was endocrine, and that was slower speed. It was moving throughout the body in the tissues, typically the blood. And then in this case, the nervous tissue is also about communication, but it's high-speed electrical chemical connections. And so we see our nervous tissue in the brain and the spinal cord. That's really where we have the bulk of our nervous tissue, but of course, since we have pain receptors and touch receptors and all the different special senses in our head, you know, our vision, our smelling, our hearing, all of those things, and going to every inch of our body, we have all of these different types of receptors that are nervous system receptors. So really, we have the bulk of our nervous tissue in the brain and the spinal cord, but our cells themselves, the neurons, are going to be spread throughout all of our tissues. And that's what's giving us feedback for pain, for example, or temperature or touch in our skin, for example. So these are four. We have the last one that we just talked about, our nervous tissue. We have the muscular tissue. Then if we zoom out here, we have our connective tissue and our epithelial tissue. And as I mentioned, as we're moving along through our semester here, we're going to be taking a closer look at the differences between these tissues as we come across them, and some of the specifics of the different types of tissue, like the connective tissue I mentioned, areolar, which is spelled incorrectly here. Sorry about that, areolar. Also blood and bone, and we're going to talk about the specifics of each of these. So right now, what you need to know are these four general tissue types, their functions, which we mentioned, lining, connecting, movement, and communication, and then kind of some of the examples that I gave. So one thing that I do want to mention before we finish up with our tissues is that there are different types of cell surface extensions. So cell surface extensions. And some of these were gone over in the organelles video, and we can talk about them there. But there's also one that was missed. So the first one is cilia. So cilia, as you may remember, are these long, thin folds of cell membrane, and they're like little tiny hairs on the cell. So the long, thin folds of cell membrane. So if we're looking at a cell, for example, we'll just kind of take an epithelial cell. This is where we see cilia a lot, is we'll have, if this black drawing here, this is the outside of the cell, let's say this is the nucleus here, and we've got different organelles in here. At the top of the cell, which I'm saying is this portion here, we can have the plasma membrane kind of go up and then come down, and then go up and then come down. And these really thin, really long folds are like little tiny hairs on top of the cell, and those little tiny hairs are what we call cilia. And these cilia are important for regions like the trachea, for example. When we swallow something or we're breathing in and we get dust particles or chemicals or something in our body or in our lungs, then our lungs help to get that out of there, that we don't want that sitting in our body. Also, bacteria can get trapped in the cilia because typically cilia have mucus along it as well. Mucus is sitting on top of the cilia, catches something like a bacteria, catches some smoke, catches debris and dust, and then the cilia are going to wave, they're going to beat to where they're kind of going out this way, let's say. So they start over here and then they move this direction, and they're pushing things along the surface of the cilia, bringing them up into the mouth so that we can cough them out. So cilia are also seen in the female reproductive system. They are along the uterine tube, also called the fallopian tube, and it's bringing the egg, the ova, toward the uterus. Another cell surface extension is microvilli. Now, microvilli are also thin folds of the cell membrane, but they are shorter. So shorter, thin folds of the cell membrane. And these thin folds, so up here, our cilia are used to sweep substances across the surface of the cell. So sweep substances across surface of cell. Now our microvilli are shorter, and I'll draw those over here next to the cilia. So they're shorter and a little bit fatter. So this would be an example of microvilli, you can see here. Microvilli. So they are shorter. They're also still thin folds, but they're definitely shorter. And these are used to increase the surface area of a cell so that we have better absorption. So increase surface area. So, for example, in our digestive tract, in our intestines, we have our food coming down the digestive tract here. And if we have all of these molecules bumping into the surface of this cell, as it's moving along, if we have these folds, there's more space for this stuff to be absorbed so that we can then get it into the cell. So the microvilli are very important. And we'll talk more about that as we get to the digestive system as well, but it's important that you know that here, along with our different types of cells or different tissue types. So cilia, microvilli, and then the third one that I want to mention is flagella. And this has also been mentioned previously in the organelles video, but this is a single long cell surface extension. And this is used only for swimming, and it's only found in human sperm cells, in the human. So there are lots of bacteria that have flagella, archaea that have flagella. So there are other organisms, protozoa, that have flagella. But when we're talking about our human body and we're studying our human body, we're only talking about swimming, and we're talking about the sperm cell. And so we probably have seen that. We've got the little head here and the acrosome, and then we've got our flagella, which is kind of the long tail there that's going to move around, kind of spin around, and allow the cell to then be propelled forward to try to get to the ova. So these are three different types of cell surface extensions that you need to be aware of. The cilia, which are like tiny little hairs that are going to move things across the surface of the cell. The microvilli, which are shorter folds of the cell membrane, and they're used for increasing the surface area for absorption. And then the flagella, which is a single long cell surface extension, and that's going to be used for movement in that it will be moving the cell itself. For example, in the human body, a sperm cell.